The call for air support went unanswered. 6 SEALs trapped in a valley, their ammo nearly gone. Above them, nothing but static and silence. Until the ground began to tremble, and an old A-10 that shouldn't even exist came screaming over the ridge. No one saw who flew it, but someone, somewhere, had just broken every rule in the book. You're watching The Storyscapes, where forgotten courage takes flight again. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from tonight? The night air over Kandahar was unnaturally still, a silence so heavy it pressed against the walls of the forward operating base. Inside Hangar 3, Elara Hayes wiped the last trace of oil from her hands, staring at the gutted frame of an A-10 Thunderbolt II. The jet had been grounded for years, its nameplate burned, serial numbers stripped, cockpit gutted. But she'd kept it alive, quietly, piece by piece. Not because anyone asked her to, but because she couldn't stand watching something built to protect people rot into silence. In the command center a few hundred meters away, alarms began to wail. A convoy had gone dark in Sector 9. 6 SEALs pinned in a valley. Enemy armor was rolling in fast, and the nearest combat-ready aircraft were 70 miles away. Elara listened from the doorway as officers shouted coordinates and scrambled for options. "Negative," one voice barked. "All Warthogs are committed. Nothing left on the flight line." She glanced back at the wreck in the hangar, at the faded emblem on its nose, the ghostly outline of a shark mouth half hidden under dust. The forgotten jet, the one everyone said could never fly again. Minutes later, the base shook. A shockwave rippled through the night, mortar fire closer than it should have been. Generators flickered, plunging the hangar into darkness. Elara felt it before she saw it, the hum beneath her boots, the metallic resonance of something alive under layers of metal fatigue. She pressed her palm to the cold fuselage. It was almost as if the jet itself was breathing again. "Maintenance, shut it down!" a voice yelled through the radio. "Hangar 3's fuel line is not secure." But there was no one left in the hangar except her. Outside, the sky glowed orange. The command tower had taken a hit. SEAL Team Echo was still transmitting distress calls, their signal breaking apart. "Under fire, last coordinates, any air cover." Then static. Elara looked at the switch panel she'd wired together in secret, a Frankenstein network of bypass circuits and hand-soldered connections. She'd built it out of scrap, out of boredom, out of hope. She wasn't sure anymore. But when she flipped the master breaker, the hangar filled with a deep, low rumble. Engines coughed, sputtered, then caught. For the first time in 6 years, the lost A-10 roared back to life. Every gauge was redlining, every warning light flashing. She should have stopped. She didn't. Because somewhere out there, 6 voices were still waiting for help that would never come. And if command couldn't send anyone, maybe it was time someone who wasn't supposed to fly did it anyway. The engines roared so loud the floor seemed to pulse beneath her feet, a sound that hadn't echoed through this hangar since the day Lieutenant Marshal Drake never came home. The vibration cut through the silence of the blackout like a heartbeat that refused to die. Elara adjusted the throttle, the old metal trembling under her touch. Dust fell from the rafters. She knew she was breaking at least a dozen regulations, probably more. But that didn't stop her hands from moving with the precision of someone who had done this in another life. She had once been on the flight path, not behind the wrenches, years ago, before the accident that grounded her, before command decided her skills were better suited for maintenance than the sky. The military never forgave imperfection. A single mistake had cost her wings, but she had never stopped hearing the sound of engines in her dreams. And now, standing alone in the dim flicker of emergency lights, she was about to trade everything for one more chance to do the right thing. Outside, explosions rolled closer, painting the horizon with waves of fire. Through the hangar doors, she could see shadows running, ground crews, medics, anyone still breathing. The control tower had gone dark. No radar, no comms, no authorization, which meant no one could tell her to stop. The old A-10's hydraulics groaned as she lowered the flaps manually. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't even safe, but it was alive. She climbed into the cockpit, the smell of burnt circuitry mixing with the metallic sting of jet fuel. The seat felt wrong, too big, too foreign, but her body remembered what her mind had tried to forget. Fingers flew over the panels, checking fuel flow, cross-feeding pumps, redundant ignition lines. She'd replaced most of these parts by hand. She knew where every cable hid, every wire hummed, every gauge lied. "Hayes, report!" someone shouted over the intercom, but the frequency cracked and died. The main grid was gone. She was on her own now, flying blind before she even left the ground. She hesitated just long enough to glance at the cracked photo taped to the console. Drake and his squadron, frozen in a moment that never came back. Beneath it, scrawled in grease pencil, the same phrase that had always haunted her. No one left behind. She hit the ignition. The turbine screamed, a metallic cry that rattled the windows. Flames burst from the exhaust nozzles, lighting the hangar like dawn. The A-10 lunged forward, tires shrieking against the floor, slamming into the night as the heavy doors gave way. Wind tore through her hair, the scent of oil and gunpowder rushing in like a memory. The base was chaos now. Vehicles overturned, alarms flashing, soldiers ducking for cover as debris rained from the sky. Some turned, stunned, as the ghost jet emerged from Hangar 3 in a blaze of dust and flame. No markings, no call sign, no record. It was as if a ghost had decided to fly again. Inside the cockpit, Elara's pulse merged with the thundering rhythm of the engines. Every instinct screamed that this was suicide. No flight plan, no radar support, minimal visibility. But the valley was less than 40 miles away, and she knew the terrain like she'd built it herself. The old targeting pod flickered to life, the map barely holding a signal. She set a course. In the operations bunker, a surviving officer stared at the radar display, confused. "What's that blip? We don't have anything airborne." "Must be an echo or debris." But the echo moved with intent. It was climbing, turning, heading straight toward the last known SEAL coordinates. Elara adjusted the comms, knowing no one could hear her, but speaking anyway. "Echo 9, inbound," she whispered, a name she'd never been authorized to use. The valley lay ahead, hidden beneath clouds and fire. Somewhere down there, 6 soldiers were still alive, waiting for help that wasn't coming. And in that moment, Elara stopped being a mechanic. She became the answer to a promise the world had forgotten. The A-10 broke through the clouds, its shadow gliding over the mountains like a silent omen. Below, the valley flashed with gunfire. Elara exhaled, locked her target, and pushed the trigger forward. The A-10 broke through the clouds, its shadow gliding over the mountains like a silent omen. Below, the valley flashed with gunfire. Elara steadied the stick, forcing her breath to match the vibration of the engines. The SEALs were pinned between armored vehicles and cliffs, flashes of gunfire showing where they still fought. The targeting pod flickered, heat signatures crowding the ridge. There was no time to think, only act. She armed the GAU-8. The cannon's low growl filled the cockpit, a sound she'd missed like a pulse that had once been her own. The trigger snapped under her hand, and the valley erupted. Fire rolled across the earth, tearing open the night. Metal shattered, silhouettes scattered, and the sound kept rising until it drowned her heartbeat. She pulled into a climb, body crushed against the seat as the A-10 shuddered. Warning lights screamed, hydraulics dropping. Right aileron hit, but she kept the jet level, eyes locked on the horizon. She had no command feed, no radar, no authorization, just instinct. And instinct had been the reason she'd lost her wings years ago. They'd called her reckless, said she reacted too fast, felt too much. Maybe they were right, but right now, that recklessness was saving lives. Smoke curled into the cockpit, the smell of burnt wiring mixing with fuel. "Hold together," she whispered. "Just a little longer." Below, the SEALs looked up, stunned by the sight of a warthog with no markings screaming through the clouds. Sergeant Cole watched the streak of fire rip through enemy lines and said what everyone was thinking. That jet doesn't exist. But the ground shaking beneath their boots told a different story. Elara leveled off, breath ragged, mind calculating how little she had left. The fuel gauge sat near empty. Ammunition half gone. The right engine coughed, leaving a trail of smoke. It should have been over. She could have turned back, vanished before anyone knew what she'd done. But her eyes drifted to the cracked photo taped to the console. Lieutenant Drake, grinning beside this same jet years ago. Beneath it, written in grease pencil, "No one left behind." Her hand tightened around the stick. Turning back wasn't an option. She banked sharply, circling toward the heat rising from the valley. The targeting pod failed, the display fading to static. She flew by memory, by feel, trusting the rhythm of the battlefield she'd studied for years from the ground. The A-10 dove again, lower than doctrine ever allowed. Wind screamed against the canopy. Below, enemy reinforcements poured in, armored trucks, mortars, shadows moving fast. She lined up one more run. Miles away, in the underground bunker, two officers argued over a blank radar screen. "There's something moving in Sector 9, one said. "Impossible. All aircraft are grounded." "Then explain why the enemy is burning." Elara didn't hear them. She was past fear now, flying on adrenaline and instinct. The engines strained, one coughing in protest. She whispered to the ghost who once flew this jet, "Let's finish what you started." Then she pressed the trigger. The GAU-8's roar split the night. A river of fire swept through the canyon, cutting down the last wave. The sky flashed white, then faded to silence. The instruments went dark, the hum inside the cockpit softening into stillness. The jet was dying beneath her, power draining away. But through the smoke below, she could see them, the SEALs running toward extraction, alive because she hadn't stopped. Elara exhaled slowly. "Mission complete," she said, her voice shaking. "Cost to follow." The explosions faded into an eerie stillness, the kind that made silence feel alive. Smoke clung to the canyon like fog, and for a long moment there was no movement, just the slow echo of metal cooling in the dark. Then a voice cracked through the static on the SEAL's battered radio, disbelieving and hoarse. "This is Echo Team. Air support confirmed. We're moving." They didn't know who had saved them, and they didn't have time to ask. The sound of distant rotors signaled their extraction inbound, but even as they pulled back, every man kept glancing upward, searching for the jet that had appeared from nowhere and vanished into cloud. Elara barely felt her hands. The controls were sluggish now, every response delayed. the A-10 bleeding altitude with each second. Warning alarms screamed in a chorus she no longer heard. She had no navigation data, no radar, no working comms, only the hum of an aircraft that had given everything it had. The right engine flickered in and out like a dying star. She cut power to stabilize, gliding through the haze, the horizon a blur of firelight and smoke. For a moment she thought about ejecting, but the seat mechanism was dead. She wasn't surprised. Nothing about tonight was supposed to work. Back at the base, the radar operators were staring at a screen that shouldn't have shown anything. A single blip pulsed faintly, where there had been none for hours. "What is that?" a young airman asked. The duty officer leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "Hangar Three's bird, the one on the scrap manifest." "That's impossible. Tell that to whoever's flying it." The command center erupted with noise, calls for identification, attempts to reach a signal, confusion giving way to realization. Somewhere in the chaos, a colonel recognized the tail code, long since retired. "That aircraft was written off 6 years ago. There's no pilot assigned." "Then someone just brought a ghost back to life," another officer replied. Elara's vision swam. The oxygen mask was cracked, every breath shallow. Her hands trembled as she reached across the console, flicking manual toggles, diverting fuel from dead lines to the left engine. She could still feel the A-10 fighting to stay airborne, like a wounded creature refusing to die. She wasn't sure how far she was from base, maybe 30 miles, maybe 50, but she knew she wouldn't make it on both engines. The world outside had gone almost quiet, only the whisper of air tearing past the fuselage. Below, the SEALs watched from their evacuation zone as a faint silhouette crossed the moon. The jet was limping, smoke trailing behind it, but it was still moving east, toward the direction of the friendly lines. Sergeant Cole lowered his binoculars, eyes followed the dying shape. "Whoever that is, they didn't just save us. They gave everything they had." Back in the hangar, fire crews were scrambling as reports of a rogue Warthog spread across the base. Mechanics who had worked beside Elara looked at each other, realization dawning too late. Her name wasn't on the duty roster. Her toolbox sat open, still warm. The logbook she always kept on the workbench had one new entry, written hastily in black marker. "If it flies, it fights." Elara guided the jet toward the horizon. The lights of the base flickered in the distance like scattered embers. She wasn't sure what would happen when she reached them. Court-martial? Arrest? Maybe worse. But that no longer mattered. Somewhere behind her, men were alive because she had disobeyed every rule she'd ever sworn to follow. And if she had to pay for it, she would. As the ground rose to meet her, the left engine coughed again, the jet lurching sideways. Warning lights flared red across the panel. She fought the controls, forcing the nose up, heart hammering against the harness. The radio crackled once, faint but clear. A voice, command, cut through the static. "Unidentified aircraft, respond. Identify yourself." She smiled through cracked lips, voice barely a whisper. "Hangar 3, reporting in." The screen went dead, and in the valley miles away, a single line of tracer fire arced across the sky, vanishing into silence, like a final salute from the earth to the one who had refused to stay grounded. "Hangar 3, reporting in." The horizon blurred into a smear of smoke and dawn as the A-10 staggered home, one engine failing with every mile. The cockpit was filled with warning tones: fuel critical, hydraulic pressure 0, electrical failure imminent. Elara could barely make out the instruments anymore, but she didn't need them. She knew this aircraft's pulse by heart. Every vibration, every groan in the frame told her what was breaking, and what still fought to live. The base lights shimmered faintly through the haze, a fragile promise she wasn't sure she'd reach. Wind howled through a crack in the canopy, cutting her face with sand and heat. Her arms burned from the effort of holding the controls steady. The stick felt heavier with each passing second. She checked her altitude, too high to eject, too low to glide far. Come on, girl. You've done enough. Just a little more. On the ground, floodlights flared across the tarmac. Emergency crews scrambled as radar confirmed what no one had dared to believe. Unidentified aircraft inbound, low altitude, no IFF code, someone shouted. It's coming from the south. The commander stepped forward, disbelief tightening his jaw. That's the wreck from Hangar 3. Who's in that cockpit? Elara adjusted her heading, aligning with the runway lights. She could see vehicles scattering, firefighters waving, sirens wailing through the wind. The A-10's left engine sputtered one final time before seizing completely. The aircraft lurched, nose dipping hard. The ground rushed upward, but she fought back with everything left in her arms, forcing the yoke against gravity's pull. Metal screamed, hydraulics burst, and for a few eternal seconds, she was weightless, balanced between falling and flying. The jet struck the runway tail first, skidding across the tarmac in a shower of sparks. One landing gear collapsed, sending the fuselage spinning sideways. Fire tore along the wing, a rolling orange wave that swallowed the paint and numbers. She braced for the explosion, but the A-10 refused to break apart. It slid to a stop near the edge of the airfield, engine silent, cockpit shrouded in smoke. Then nothing. No movement, no sound.
Rescue teams swarmed the wreck, cutting through the canopy. The heat was blinding, but when they reached the seat, it was empty. No pilot. Only a flight helmet resting on the console, visor cracked, nameplate burned clean. The harness straps were torn, but there was no trace of blood. The crew searched every inch of the area, shouting her name, finding only a faint trail of footprints leading into the smoke, then vanishing completely. At dawn, the fires were out. The base stood in stunned quiet, everyone asking the same question no one could answer. Mechanics walked the hangars in silence until one of them found Elara's logbook on the workbench, pages still open. The last entry was dated that same night. Tested power restoration. Possible flight readiness confirmed. Below it, in smaller handwriting, for Drake. Hours later, a helicopter carrying the rescued SEALs touched down. The men climbed out, bandaged and exhausted, eyes scanning the runway littered with debris. Sergeant Cole paused beside the burned A-10, running a gloved hand across the still warm metal. "She saved us, whoever she was," he said quietly. The colonel standing nearby didn't answer. He was staring at the nose of the aircraft, where under layers of soot and melted paint, faint letters had reappeared, etched by heat rather than hand. E-A-L-H. The sun climbed higher, turning the airfield gold. Smoke curled from the engine vents like breath fading into morning. Somewhere out beyond the perimeter fence, a single set of footprints trailed off into the desert. No one ever found where they ended. Some said she'd bailed out and vanished before the explosion. Others swore they saw a figure walking along the horizon at first light, head held high, flight suit torn, helmet under one arm. None of it was proven. But every mechanic who worked that shift swore that when the hangar doors were sealed later that day, the lights above the old workbench flickered once, just long enough to make the tools rattle against the metal tray. And then, like a heartbeat spent, the silence returned. Days passed before the desert stopped smelling like smoke. The wreck of the A-10 was towed into the far corner of the airfield, cordoned off by yellow tape and silence. The investigation teams came and went, clipboards in hand, recording everything they couldn't explain. There was no flight authorization, no radio log, no radar confirmation. And yet, 6 SEALs were alive, rescued by a jet that officially hadn't moved in years. In the command building, the colonel wrote his final report under the heading, Incident, Hangar 3 Anomaly. Every page circled back to the same unanswered question, who flew it? He replayed camera footage from the night of the attack, frame by frame, until one image froze him. A figure climbing into the cockpit, hair tied back, flight suit half-zipped, the reflection of firelight on her face. The timestamp placed it moments before the blackout. He recognized her. Maintenance technician, Elara Hayes.
Rescue teams swarmed the wreck, cutting through the canopy. The heat was blinding, but when they reached the seat, it was empty. No pilot, only a flight helmet resting on the console. Visor cracked, nameplate burned clean. The harness straps were torn, but there was no trace of blood. The crew searched every inch of the area, shouting her name, finding only a faint trail of footprints leading into the smoke, then vanishing completely. At dawn, the fires were out. The base stood in stunned quiet, everyone asking the same question no one could answer. Mechanics walked the hangars in silence until one of them found Elara's logbook on the workbench, pages still open. The last entry was dated that same night. Tested power restoration, possible flight readiness confirmed. Below it, in smaller handwriting, for Drake. Hours later, a helicopter carrying the rescued SEALs touched down. The men climbed out, bandaged and exhausted, eyes scanning the runway littered with debris. Sergeant Cole paused beside the burned A-10, running a gloved hand across the still warm metal. She saved us, whoever she was, he said quietly. A colonel standing nearby didn't answer. He was staring at the nose of the aircraft, where under layers of soot and melted paint, faint letters had reappeared, etched by heat rather than hand. E. Hayes. The sun climbed higher, turning the airfield gold. Smoke curled from the engine vents like breath, fading into morning. Somewhere out beyond the perimeter fence, a single set of footprints trailed off into the desert. No one ever found where they ended. Some said she'd bailed out and vanished before the explosion. Others swore they saw a figure walking along the horizon at first light, head held high, flight suit torn, helmet under one arm. None of it was proven. But every mechanic who worked that shift swore that when the hangar doors were sealed later that day, the lights above the old workbench flickered once, just long enough to make the tools rattle against the metal tray. And then, like a heartbeat spent, the silence returned. Days passed before the desert stopped smelling like smoke. The wreck of the A-10 was towed into the far corner of the airfield, cordoned off by yellow tape and silence. The investigation teams came and went, clipboards in hand, recording everything they couldn't explain. There was no flight authorization, no radio log, no radar confirmation. And yet 6 SEALs were alive, rescued by a jet that officially hadn't moved in years. In the command building, the colonel wrote his final report under the heading, Incident, Hangar 3 Anomaly. Every page circled back to the same unanswered question, who flew it? He replayed camera footage from the night of the attack, frame by frame, until one image froze him. A figure climbing into the cockpit, hair tied back, flight suit half-zipped, the reflection of firelight on her face. The timestamp placed it moments before the blackout. He recognized her. Maintenance technician, Elara Hayes. No one left behind. The engines fade into dawn, leaving the sky empty, but never silent, because somewhere the lost one still flies.